I enjoyed introspection, shrouded myself in cogitation. With what rapture did I listen for the rustling of frail insects in the thickets of my nerves? A hostility towards the sun was my only rebellion against the spirit of the age. I hankered after Novelis's night and Yeatsy and Irish twilights. However, from the time the war ended, I gradually sensed that an era was approaching in which to treat the sun as the enemy would be tantamount to following the herd. The literary works written or put before the public around that time were dominated by night thoughts, though their night was less aesthetic than mine. To be really respected at that time, moreover, one's darkness had to be rich and cloying, not thin. Even the rich, honeyed night in which I had myself wallowed in my boyhood seemed to them, apparently, very thin stuff indeed. Little by little, I began to feel uncertain about the night in which I had placed such trust during the war, and to suspect that I might have belonged with the sun worshippers all along. It may well have been so. Even if it was indeed, I began to wonder, might not my persistent hostility towards the sun and the continued importance I attached to my own small private night be no more than a desire to follow the herd? The men who indulged in nocturnal thought, it seemed to me, had without exception dry, lusterless skins and sagging stomachs. They sought to wrap up a whole epoch in a capacious night of ideas and rejected in all its forms the sun that I had seen. They rejected both life and death, as I had seen them, for in both of these the sun had a hand. It was in 1952, on the deck of the ship on which I made my first journey abroad, that I exchanged a reconciliatory handshake with the sun. From that day on, I had found myself unable to part company with it. The sun became associated with the main highway of my life, and little by little, it tanned my skin brown, branding me as a member of the other race. One might object that thought belongs essentially to the night, that creation with words is of necessity carried out in the fevered darkness of night. Indeed, I had still not lost my old habit of working through the small hours, and I was surrounded by people whose skins unmistakably bore witness to nocturnal thinking. Yet why must it be that men always seek out the depths, the abyss? Why must thought, like a plumb line, concern itself with the vertical descent? Why was it not feasible for thought to change direction and climb vertically up, ever up, towards the surface? Why should the area of the skin, which guarantees a human being's existence in space, be most despised and left to the tender mercies of the senses? I could not understand the laws governing the motion of thought, the way it was liable to get stuck in the unseen chasms whenever it set out to go deep, or whenever it aimed at the heights, to soar away into the boundless and equally invisible heavens, leaving the corporeal form undeservedly neglected. If the law of thought is that it should search out profundity, whether it extends upwards or downwards, then it seemed excessively logical to me that men should not discover depths of a kind in the surface, that vital borderline that endorses our separatenesses and our form, dividing our exterior from our interior. Why should they not be attracted to the profundity of the surface itself? The sun was enticing, almost dragging my thoughts away from their night of visceral sensations, away from the swelling of muscles encased in sunlit skin, and it was commanding me to construct a new and sturdy dwelling in which my mind, as it rose little by little to the surface, could live in security. That dwelling was a tanned, lustrous skin and powerful, sensitively rippling muscles. I came to feel that it was precisely because such an abode was required that the average intellectual failed to feel at home with a thought that concerned itself with forms and surfaces. The nocturnal outlook, produced of diseased inner organs, is given shape almost before its owner is aware which came first, the outlook itself, or the first faint morbid symptoms in the inner organs. And yet, in remote recesses, invisible to the eye, the body creates and regulates its own thought. With the surface, on the other hand, which is visible to everybody, training of the body must take precedence over training of thought if it is to create and supervise its own ideas. The need for me to study my body could have been foreseen from that moment when I first felt the attraction of its profundities. I was aware that the only thing that could justify such an idea was muscle. Who pays any attention to a physical education theorist grown decrepit? The One might accept the pallid scholar's toying with nocturnal thoughts in the privacy of his study, but what could seem more meager, more chilly than his lips were they to speak, whether in praise or blame of the body? So well acquainted was I with poverty of that type, that one day, quite suddenly, it occurred to me to require ample muscles of my own. I would draw attention to hear one fact, that everything that shows proceeded from my own. I believe that just as physical training will transform supposedly involuntary muscles into voluntary ones, so a similar transformation can be achieved through training in the mind. Both body and mind, through an inevitable tendency that one might also call natural law, are inclined to lapse into automatism, and I have found by experience that a large stream may be deflected by digging a small channel. This is another example of the quality that our spirits and bodies have in common. That tendency to share the body and the mind to instantly create their own small universe, their own false order whenever, at a particular time, they are taken control of by one particular idea. Although what happens in fact represents a kind of standstill, it is experienced as though it were a burst of lively, centripetal activity. The function of the body and the mind in creating, for a short while, their own miniature universes is, in fact, no more than an illusion. Yet the fleeting sense of happiness in human life owes much to precisely this type of false order. It is a kind of protective function of life in face of the chaoses around it, and resembles the way a hedgehog rolls itself into a tight round ball. The possibility then presented itself of breaking down one type of false order and creating another in its place, of turning back on itself this obstinate formative function and resetting it in a direction that better accorded to one's own aims. This idea, I decided, I would immediately put into action. Rather than idea, though, I might have said the new purpose which the sun has provided me every day. It was thus that I found myself confronted with those lumps of steel, heavy, forbidding, cold, as though the essence of night had in them been still further condensed. Chapter 3. On that day began my close relationship with steel that was to last for 10 years to come. The nature of this steel is odd. I found that as I increased its weight little by little, the effect was like a pair of scales. The bulk of muscles placed, as it were, on the other pan increased proportionately, as though the steel had a duty to maintain a strict balance between the two. Little by little, moreover, the properties of my muscles came increasingly to resemble those of the steel. The slow development, I found, was remarkably similar to the process of education which remodels the brain intellectually by feeding it with progressively more difficult matter. And since there was always a vision of the classical ideal body to serve as a model and an ultimate goal, the process closely resembled the classical ideal of education. Which of the two was it that really resembled the other? Was I not already using words in my attempt to imitate the classical physical type? For me, beauty is always retreating from one's grasp. The only thing I consider important is what existed once, or ought to have existed. By its subtle, infinitely varied operation, the steel restored the classical balance that the body had begun to lose, reinstating it in its natural form, the form that it should have had all along. The groups of muscles that have become virtually unnecessary in modern life, though still a vital element of a man's body, are obviously pointless from a practical point of view,